others. I just want to give an introduction to make it useful for everyone. I'm sure you're all familiar with the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, submitted by countries where they lay out their climate plans, also their targets. Under the current NDCs, it's estimated that implementing, so that's a global figure. Okay, I did not do anything. A global figure that it would cost approximately 5.8 to 5.9 trillion US dollar to implement the NDCs fully. So where should all the money come from, and what kind of tools do we have available to help countries to implement their NDCs? And under the Paris Agreement, Article 6, it's one of the articles in the agreement, allows countries to cooperate on emission reductions using carbon markets. And there are estimates, of course there's also different numbers around, but there's estimates that carbon market can really reduce the NDC compliance cost in large by 250 billion by 2030, which is very soon, but it could even exceed $1 trillion by 2050. So really carbon markets as a tool to finance or to have more efficient implementation of the NDC targets. So how do carbon markets work? Again, a little bit of a basic, as just a step back. Carbon markets, also referred to as emission trading, and usually we're talking about units, carbon credits, that equal 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it could also be other gases, but it's always then translated into tons of CO2 equivalent that is either reduced or sequestered or avoided, and these are the tradable units. So carbon finance, of course, and raising funds for NDC implementation. Carbon markets on the market mechanisms of Article 6 are a tool to achieve this, and a lot of countries have expressed in their NDC that they would like to use Article 6, or they're considering using or intend to use Article 6 or other carbon market instruments to achieve their NDCs. So there's a growing popularity of emission trading, really, by recognizing how to work most efficiently and how to raise the funds for the implementation of NDCs. And this map a couple of years ago was still rather gray, and more countries actually come up with emission trading solutions, and we expect even more to be implemented in the coming years. So here it says that 58% jurisdiction making up to 55% of global emissions are using emission tradings already. When we talk about carbon market, it is probably one of the most important slides in the whole set. We often refer to carbon markets, emission trading, but we have to be aware that there are actually different segments of the carbon market when we talk about it. So we usually can divide between a voluntary carbon market, a compliance market, and the Article 6 market. So for all of these elements of the carbon markets, there's different use of the credits, also different buyers. The motivation for participation is differently, and then also how it is governed and the oversight of the markets is quite different. You probably also very well, everyone heard about voluntary carbon markets, so they're mostly designed to compensate emissions from companies, corporates, also individuals can do it, but these are all voluntary actions, voluntary use of offsets, and there's no really regulation behind it. There's self-regulation in terms of these programs or independent carbon standards that help to credit and help to issue such credits. So That is quite a popular market, also for many years established already. Compliance market is a little different. It's usually a system or a carbon price put in place by countries. So the motivation is to internally within the country have an instrument to reduce emission reduction by simply putting a price on it. This could be in form of a carbon tax or an ETS, emission trading system, or there's also a whole bunch of hybrid systems, more and more hybrids, or use of tax or trading in different sectors of the economy. So usually the buyers are the compliance entities, which means corporates that under the system that's established in the jurisdiction have to comply with emission targets, and they usually receive emission allowances or a cap, and to some degree a use of offsets could be introduced. Offsets means besides the allowances, you could use credits from the voluntary carbon market, or as we will see also, of course, Article 6 market. We had the CDM was also used as a compliance offset by some of the ETSs. So these are regulated domestically, and again, also there, that's what I just showed. More and more countries are putting such systems and instruments into place. And then lastly, and that's what I'm going to talk about more in the following slides, and that's what we are talking about usually at the RCC, because we support countries also on implementing Article 6. Article 6 is again a tool for countries to achieve NDCs, and it's a tool to achieve those NDCs cooperatively, basically a cooperation between countries. And the motivation here is that they can be used to either increase the NDC ambition or achieve the existing MBC more flexibly, but basically a tool for more efficient cost-efficient implementation of NDCs. So the buyers are usually parties, can also be other compliance entities. So you may have heard about CORSIA, the airlines emission offsetting system. So they would also could use Article 6 credits. And these units, if they are the difference between the voluntary carbon market and the Article 6, and that's very important also for the foreign parties, Article 6 are authorized transferred mitigation outcomes. That's a new word. We used to just call them under the CDM emission reductions. Now, because the scope of activities is a bit larger, these outcomes in the country are called mitigation outcomes, and they can be transferred internationally. And when they are transferred, or they can only be transferred if the country authorizes such a transfer and also applies corresponding adjustments. I will explain this later. Basically, it's just making sure that these same achievements are only used by one country. So once you transfer it, you cannot account for it yourself under your NDC. But Article 6 markets, and I'll get to Article 6.4, there are different parts of the Paris Agreement, can also be used for voluntary carbon market. If the country doesn't want to authorize it, the outcome would just stay within the host country, but could be used by corporates as a voluntary offset tool. I know that doesn't make it much easier, but I hope just the differentiation here between these three parts of the market is very important, and in the following we will be focusing more on Article 6 market. And I'm happy to answer any questions and go back to the slides later if that's necessary. So, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Now we finally get to that one. It's been introduced as an incentive and to facilitate the participation of public and private sector in mitigation action, and it actually really by by introducing Article 6, it's a way to involve and engage the private sector and set incentives for private sector to be part of the implementation of NDCs and contribute to the achievement of targets. It's actually the only part of the Paris Agreement where the private sector gets actively involved. So that's quite important. And it's also, the intention is really to enhance regional cooperation. Also, as I said, pull in non-party stakeholders, cities, other subnational authorities. We may also look into this a little bit. Local communities, anyone could participate in this. Article 6 has different elements, and they're usually referred to as Article 6.2, that's the subparagraph, 6.4, and 6.8. The two market mechanisms are 6.2 and 6.4, and 6.2, starting with this one, it's a bilateral cooperation between countries. So actually it regulates how countries can exchange these mitigation outcomes. As I mentioned, they are called then ITMOs if they are internationally transferred, and achieving technical support, capacity building, or of course finance compensation for the trade of ITMOs. It is bilateral. That means there are some guiding rules set by parties in the Paris Agreement and the following regulations, but a lot of it is then really agreed bilaterally between countries, and we'll probably look into some examples on this. Yeah, there are a few already happening, not too many though. Next one, yeah. And Article 6.4, it's a mechanism. It's called PACM, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. And for those of you who are around in the carbon market for a little bit longer, you're most likely all well aware of the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. And what we have here, the PACM, is a successor of the CDM, basically a new mechanism under the Paris Agreement, trying to improve and learn also from the implementation of the CDM. We have here a supervisory body who is really supervising and making the rules for the mechanism. As we speak here, is actually this body meets several times per year. They are just right now, I think today is the last day of their 14th meeting in Baku. So they come up with new rules and new tools and methodologies, not yet, but hopefully soon. They're also making recommendations to the parties, which means once the parties meet again in Baku for the COP29, the next big global climate conference in November, they will also decide then on the recommendations and coming from the supervisory body on how to implement this mechanism. It is not yet fully operational, also partly because we didn't have an outcome on Article 6 decisions in Dubai last year, but it has already agreed on most of the rules. There's still some guidance needed from COP29 this year, but then the Article 6.4 mechanism will become operational. Again, and then you can register, and actually authorized entities can register projects under the mechanism just as they would do with independent carbon standards, just like maybe the gold standard or Vera are familiar names to you, or the CDM. So you could register projects here. The difference between 6.2 and 6.4 is 6.2 is a bilateral agreement between countries. Here, 6.4, the supervisory body has a lot of function. For example, they develop the methodologies to use, the standards, how to account and how to monitor these projects. There is an issuance of credits. There's a registry for 6.4. So basically, it's providing a lot of services that then countries can use and don't have to develop it directly in a bilateral agreement. Yeah, and then just maybe for completeness, because I did mention 6.8, it's also part of the Paris Agreement. It's also focusing on cooperation, but it's non-market, means that there is a country cooperation, but without the exchange of carbon credits. So that is the only difference. So that could be kind of voluntary support and cooperation, technical finance, capacity building. There is a platform that went online this year, and maybe slowly some first submissions also come, basically as examples also for others to follow such approaches. Article 6 activity types, it's very comprehensive. It covers a large, basically no real limitations on emission reduction projects. Then also removals are included. Still the guidance there is not finalized, but more and more there's also a growing interest in removal projects. But yeah, there's almost no limitation. A little bit on mitigation avoidance is a bit tricky issue still under the negotiations. Now briefly, to participate in 6.2 and 6.4, there is a couple of requirements that parties have to take before they can participate. First of all, and I think that's pretty easy and obvious, must be a party of the Paris Agreement and must have prepared and communicated an NDC. Then also while you participate, you have to update your NDC, you have to maintain your NDC, and you also have to show how the activities under Article 6 contributes to the achievement of your NDC and on your sustainability targets, but I think that comes in a different point. Now for 6.2, as I mentioned, you have to manage and develop all the infrastructure for registering, for reporting, and authorizing. That's a very important aspect. The country has to authorize the transfer. So all this has to be put in place by the cooperating parties. You have to submit your most recent national inventory report. And additionally, as an implication, you also have to be able to track your ITMOs. So whenever you transfer these mitigation outcomes, you have to be able to have a registry to track it, so that at the end of your NDC period, you can show how much emission reductions were transferred or received. For 6.4, as it is a central mechanism with a supervisory body, a party that wants to participate has to nominate a DNA. That was the same under the CDM, so it's a national entity that receives the authority to communicate directly on Article 6. Basically also provide host country approval of projects. Countries have to publicly indicate what kind of activities they consider for approval. So as you have to show how these activities contribute to your NDC and sustainable development, usually parties come forward with a list of activities that they intend to use, because some of them you may not want to sell or you may not want to transfer and use for your own NDC. So this would be a list of technologies or project types where you say, okay, we can transfer it because they are receiving the support through the mechanism and thereby be able to be implemented. You have to show how you contribute, how these activities contribute to sustainable development, and you may also give an indication on crediting periods or baselines and methodologies other than what the supervisory body established. The host country has more flexibility and freedom to adjust and say, yeah, we only want to use a shorter crediting period, or we want to set a different baseline. That is all part of host country flexibility. Now, I mentioned that Article 6 was a tool or is a tool to also raise NDC ambition, and how is that supposed to work? As a host country, when you transfer mitigation outcomes, then they will be called ITMOs, as I mentioned. You would usually receive some payment for it, a reimbursement of costs, and these revenues should ideally be reinvested in other mitigation activities. Thereby, you'd be able to raise more capital for more ambitious additional actions. And as a buyer country, you would use the ITMOs to lower your compliance cost. If your own achievement of your NDC is very costly in your country and you're able to save some of the money by buying ITMOs, you would be able to again reinvest the savings for more ambitious targets. So that is the overall intention. And this one looks complicated. I don't want to go too much into details, but what is important here, and I mentioned before, there is a tool or a mechanism called corresponding adjustments, which is supposed to guarantee that mitigation outcomes are not accounted for twice. So we have here a host country and an acquiring country, and the yellow is actually the part of the ITMO transfer. So the host country would transfer the ITMOs to the acquiring country, but can then not claim it as their own achievements under their NDC. So basically, countries have to be quite careful and have to really think, well, what are the activities that we want to sell? These should usually be activities that they cannot achieve by themselves, so that the activity is additional. And since it's additional, it would be then transferred and claimed by the acquiring country and not by the host country anymore. So the main takeaway is that anything that is transferred under Article 6 as ITMOs can only be accounted by one country, in this case the acquiring country, and not by the host country anymore. Article 6 readiness, I did mention the participation requirements, but there's also a lot of other steps that countries need to take to actually, before being able to implement in Article 6 projects. And this is really just as an example, and to again start thinking what the country needs to put in place. So ideally develop a strategy on Article 6. As I mentioned, you have to think, well, which kind of activities you want to conduct with support and then transfer, because you cannot use them for your own NDC anymore. But you can also look at it, if you transfer it in this NDC period and then the crediting period of the project is over, you would still have continuous emission reductions for your next NDC period and to long-term emission strategy. So that is quite important to have a clear vision on how to use Article 6, have to build in-country capacities for better understanding how that works, and then once you put the governance and arrangements in place, like who should be doing what, who is responsible, who is authorized within the country to maybe authorize the projects, or to validate, or to come up with a list of technologies. So all these kind of arrangements have to be put in place and ideally put into like legal regulations, so that there is no doubt. And then you can also establish the processes for each of these entities on how to do their job. Coming to an end, at least of the presentation, then we'll have time for questions. So why is that important, and why should we actually participate in Article 6 or carbon markets? So again, it's important to remember that it's a tool. There's nothing like we are doing carbon market just for the fun of it or something. It's really a tool to achieve emission reduction, and Article 6 is a tool for achieving NDC targets. It is the only part of the Paris Agreement it directly engages business and private sector, so that is quite important to remember. There's a quite an interest globally on such kind of corporations, as we see also with already implemented and more projects being implemented, and also by the number of countries that have indicated to use Article 6 for the NDCs. We also see carbon markets in general, a lot of similar tools like the independent carbon standards are coming up. So, and the centralized mechanism, meaning the PACM, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, is also a tool for a quick access. You don't have, as a host country, you don't have to establish and develop all this in a bilateral agreement. You could just use existing infrastructure. Just finally, before closing, I did mention the RCC Asia Pacific. Our region is covering here the countries in blue. It's one of 6 UNFCCC regional centers. And it's hosted in Bangkok by IGS, that's Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. We also have colleagues here in the MENA and South Asia region where we work very closely because of a little bit of an overlap there in South Asia. They've been established over the past 10 years, also really a network. We don't show Bonn, that's actually our 7th RCC, the headquarter, who's managing all the RCCs. Yeah, and it's supposed to be these RCCs originate from the CDM time, but now with our new work areas and the continuous support for carbon markets under Article 6, we established to be a first point of contact for parties, meaning we are the national focal point, but also non-party stakeholders. Whenever there is an interest or question or you like to get engaged, we also have newsletters. We are really in the region to support not only parties but also non-party stakeholders, and we'll try to find also through our network of other UN agencies, find maybe existing support. There's the NDC partnership, we work very closely, but also maybe A6IP, Japanese Article 6 implementation partnership. Yeah, feel free if there's any questions or requests to contact us at any time. Yeah. I think that was pretty long, but the problem is I always take very long, and today I was giving the freedom to extend as much as I want, so I didn't feel like real time pressure. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jens, for navigating us through the complexities of Article 6. Yes, with the permission of the organizers, it was initially scheduled for 45 minutes, but we were given the luxury to extend it to 1 hour if needed. So we roughly have about another 20-25 minutes to basically go through with some Q&As. And if from the audience, if there's any questions you want to basically post to Jens, please put it on the Slido. And Mr. MC, I need your help to basically pick up those questions if necessary. But Jens, you tried upon a very important point, especially with Article 6, primary goal is to basically help countries to achieve its NDCs more effectively through international cooperation, but most importantly ensuring transparency and avoiding double counting. So how can the countries leverage on Article 6 to support these NDCs targets? Because if you see Malaysian, for an example, our NDC targets are to become a low-carbon country by 2030, that's to reduce our emissions by 45% compared to the 2005 values, and then also to achieve by 2030, and to achieve net zero by 2050. So with the new climate change bill, we are basically looking into re-establishing the priorities, what is needed to come with the NDC roadmap. So how can the countries leverage on Article 6 to support these NDC targets, and what are the practical steps they should be taking to integrate these mechanisms into their local settings?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I had I'm just thinking which slide. I had some slides that already go a little bit into the direction, especially now first understanding how countries particularly can benefit from Article 6 cooperation. And then I would probably for now focus a little bit on Article 6.2, the bilateral cooperation, because there we have some examples already. But same goes for 6.4. So in general, I think what is important, and it's already maybe one of the first steps, really to come up with some clarity, ideally an Article 6 strategy on like how Article 6 can be used to implement existing NDC and how to use it beyond the existing to set maybe new, more ambitious targets in the next NDC. So how does that go? For the existing NDC, countries have set the targets, and there's also a part in the NDC, usually the conditional part, and this is where we most likely look into, because the unconditional part of your NDC you should ideally achieve without support. Just these are the targets that the country says we can comfortably achieve, or stretching ourselves very much to achieve them ourselves, but we can do it ourselves. Now the conditional part is where support is needed. So we can do more if we receive support either through climate finance or capacity building. And Article 6 could be such a cooperation where you say, okay, this is an area if we receive some support, or if we can cooperate in this area, certain technology, or if we can cooperate with a country and thereby achieving a higher emission reduction, yes, we will transfer these outcomes largely to the cooperating country, but we can use some for ourselves. So there are some agreements usually between countries on a share of emissions that stay within the host country, or emission reductions that stay within the host country. And you can use this as for achieving your NDC target. And I think even more importantly, if there is like a technology or a sector of the industry that you know is very difficult to abate, and within this NDC you have no plans to do it, you also don't have the capacity to do it, but with the foreign support you can do it, and then in the next NDC it already kind of lowers your emissions in your inventory. So basically you can set higher targets and already have done the next step towards decarbonization of a certain sector. Then, of course, as I also mentioned, reinvestment of revenue that comes in through the projects into, it could be another mitigation, but it could also be a support. Some countries set sharing of proceeds or levies, basically using part of the revenue. Could also be adaptation projects to achieve like some of your adaptation targets. Adaptation funding is always very low, so traditionally the shares of proceeds for the adaptation fund under the CDM was one of the largest contributor to the adaptation fund, and really now also under bilateral cooperation. Under Article 6.4, there is again a 5% adaptation fund contribution, but even under the bilateral cooperation, countries are encouraged to reduce, to use some of the funds for adaptation, and we see also countries doing it. So there is multiple benefits in the cooperation.
Yeah, you're right. And Malaysia, it's a bit of a complicated country, because of the fact that we have the federal status and we have 3 regions. Sabah, Sarawak is kind of, they have a bit more power in terms of autonomy. So we have always the discussion between national and subnational. And end of the day, the land belongs to the state. So, when we talk about being Article 6 ready, the need for establishing institutional frameworks, approval processes, technical capabilities, also considering this national, subnational situation, possibilities of situation in Malaysia, and hopefully that's something that we would like to avoid with the new climate change bill coming up. NRES is actually going to, or the appointed authority is going to actually handle this. What should be these critical elements for countries if they want to be Article 6 ready, if they want to be Article 6 compliant? Which area should the countries focus in terms of the institutional arrangement?
Yeah, that doesn't make it easier, but I'm sure there's also solutions. I mean, if I don't know how easy or difficult is it come to a conclusion between the federal government and the states. But in general, of course, we from UNFCCC for all the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, the BTRs, the bilateral reports that need to be submitted, and also the reporting under Article 6, so I didn't mention it, or maybe just briefly, but there are also, once you cooperate, there are reporting requirements to the UNFCCC, and all this, of course, goes through the national focal point, so it's all would be part of an authority of the national the federal government to report all this. Then any kind of passing down authority to federal ministries, or I think it could also be subnationals, also under Article 6.4, it could be corporates that are authorized by the federal government to act on their behalf. And I think what is really important, the authorization of emission transfer would still need to come from the federal government because that's the national focal point. But of course there could be within the country some kind of arrangements of other entities or subnational governments providing the recommendation or even maybe have the authority to negotiate agreements. But it all comes back that at the end, the federal government would need to report to UNFCCC and also give the authorization. So there can be a little bit of a difficult issue to resolve, but in principle, this authority can be passed on, and there can be regulations or have to be regulations in place then maybe for a state government to pre-authorize it, send it to the federal government, and then the authorization for the transfer would come. So I think this is probably, besides having a clear Article 6 strategy for the country and say how do we want to use it, such kind of arrangements, especially if there's a growing interest coming from subnational governments or states, to have a discussion and arrangements in place how that could be done, especially if there is a strong interest in a certain region or state to cooperate. But yeah, the agreement with the national authority would be also essential.
Yeah, end of the day, it's something that Malaysia has to figure out, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but this is the clarity that we are looking for from the new Climate Change Act bill first, and then the act which is actually hopefully going
Maybe
to come.
just to add something to try to make it a little clear, so because I showed voluntary carbon market, compliance market, Article 6 market, under the voluntary carbon market where there is no actual transfer of emission reductions or mitigation outcomes to other countries and no actual use against other countries' NDC, there is no need for a national authority to do that. I mean, countries also try to regulate this more and probably will do more in the future. And maybe even under the voluntary carbon markets, buyer will ask for national authorization, so that can also come in the coming years. But at the moment, voluntary carbon markets could be done even, I mean, gold standard used to ask for host country approval, but that's not all standards do that. So there could be, it's not kind of a legally binding transfer of emission reductions. Under Article 6, it's different because once you transfer it and another country can use it, you have to really deduct it from your own achievements. And this is where it can only be like one communication between the state authorities.
Yeah, you're right. We are seeing the gap between the voluntary and the compliance carbon market is actually getting thinner and thinner. And in the climate change bill, which is actually in draft, it also says that there will be some kind of a regularization of the voluntary setting as well. And I read that there's proposals to establish national integrated data repository for climate change and a creation of a national carbon registry and a creation of a national climate fund. So all these are actually being discussed now under the bill that is actually going to come. Yeah, when it comes to Article 6 readiness, and we see some countries have actually taken up the mantle already. Malaysia is actually not in the forefront, but we are not lagging behind much as well. What are the experiences that you can actually share, how different countries have Article 6, different instruments, 6.2, 6.4, or maybe 6.8 as well. What do you see? What are the things that we can learn from there?
Yeah. I think, let's start with 6.4. As I said, it's not fully operational yet. The first activities there is actually that registered and ongoing CDM projects, ongoing in a sense with remaining crediting period, could ask, or until end of last year's, were able to request a transfer of the project to Article 6.4. So we have a couple of hundred projects who have asked for such a transfer, but it needs to be authorized by the host country, and these would be the first projects that actually enter the Article 6.4 mechanism, the PACM. But for this authorization, a country has to have in place a DNA, a designated national authority needs to be nominated, which some countries have done already, still good number missing, probably globally half-half. We don't have a nomination from Malaysia yet, but there was a couple of requests for transition of these projects, so until the end of next year, the country needs to authorize it. So that is something what's happening under 6.4, and hopefully after the next conference in Baku next year, we'll have an operational 6.4 mechanism, and then countries with an existing DNA can already start approving projects, and developers in these countries can start developing projects. If you're in a country where you're not that doesn't have a nomination yet, as a project developer, it's a little tricky. You wouldn't start developing a project without knowing that the country would nominate a DNA and would also like to participate in 6.4. Some countries have already said we may not participate in 6.4, only do the bilateral cooperation. For Malaysia, I don't know, we haven't received a nomination yet. So that's the status there. Under 6.8, that's a non-market, not much happening yet. The platform has most recently been launched, but have a look at it. I think it's on the slides also, which hopefully will be distributed. There you see some examples. And I think where activities are already happening is 6.4, the bilateral cooperation. We have a handful of projects like the very early movers, mostly with the support of UNDP, for example, Climate Promise. There's Switzerland with Vanuatu, Switzerland with Ghana, also Switzerland with Thailand, where we are based. So they have already, Thailand was the first country who's done such a transfer early this year. And now the Japan with the joint crediting mechanism, it's something they have established a while ago, a little bit in competition to the CDM at the time, but also a bilateral agreement. Have roughly 140 projects globally, mostly relatively small projects, which they also now want to have transition to Article 6.2. So when they all come in, we have globally roughly 140 projects, and there's a lot of information and knowledge sharing also from these projects through webinars or workshops. Can look into this. The RCC is ready to help. There's also other support mechanism. And I think, yeah, importantly, also buyer countries are now more and more reaching out. So we have a few countries also here in the region, like Singapore, you're probably aware, Korea, Japan, Switzerland. So they're looking for such cooperation signing agreements in the countries, and then also willing to develop such projects. These countries have some kind of experience already to some degree, or have also set up their own institutions that would also be able to support the host countries. So once you are approached and sign an agreement, mostly an MOU, and then develop projects in the following, would usually receive support from the acquiring country. But again, there are also other mechanisms through UNDP, through the UNFCCC, through Japan implementation partnership. So there's quite a lot of also support available.
Yeah. And also when it comes to carbon projects, it's not just the carbon anymore, it's also the sustainability, the environmental and social safeguards. So during the CDM time, this is something that was discussed, okay, whereas the sustainability is not just carbon, but now there's a lot of push into the social safeguards, the environmental safeguards, and with the recently adopted SD tool as well for Article 6.4. What are your thoughts about it? Why sustainability is important, and what is the direction that the Article 6 is heading, especially when it comes to future project implementation?
Yeah. You mentioned the CDM and the sustainability tool. We also had such tools under the CDM, but they were quite weak compared to what we're seeing under Article 6.4. That's part of also the learning experience from the CDM, because there used to be some criticisms on some projects, and then the mechanisms in place to investigate such accusation or something were not very strong, and it still is part of the host country prerogative. So as a host country, it's your responsibility to first of all show how it contributes to your sustainable development. That was not the case under the CDM. So here really it's clearly, as you said, not only a carbon transfer, but the contribution to the sustainable development, it's much stronger emphasis. Also, yeah, there is a new tool. As I mentioned today, last day in Baku, supervisory body meeting, so we'll probably see this as a recommendation or as an approved tool then soon. And this is mandatory also for countries to use. There is a risk assessment, do no harm assessment, social environmental safeguards all in place. So much stronger guidance and regulations for the host country to make sure there's no breach of human rights or environmental risks.
I'm picking up some questions from Slido. Maybe a couple of questions before we actually sign off. There's an interesting question. Article 6 could lead to an unequal distribution of benefits, with richer nations relying on cheap carbon credits from poorer nations. What are your views on this?
Yeah. Okay. Relying is a little difficult, but of course you want to have demand in the market, so it's partly also wanted. No, the thing is, it's important that such projects, and I think this is where Article 6 puts a lot more emphasis on what we just mentioned, the contributions to sustainability, the contributions to the host country's own NDCs. So you should usually, as a host country, you also have to show how this project is additional. So how does it help you to achieve mitigation outcomes that you cannot achieve without the support. So basically, it's not about selling cheap mitigation outcomes because you may risk your own NDCs. It's really looking beyond and say, what are the technologies, what are the project types that we cannot do by ourselves, which we don't have in our NDCs, we'll most likely also not include in our next NDC, and how can this cooperation help us to actually take faster steps to be more ambitious? Then of course the country has to see what are the benefits for the host country. There are also tools, mechanisms in place like the sharing of the outcomes, or maybe part of it remains in the country. So if you think you'll be able to achieve, I don't know, 500,000 tons of emission reductions and you're selling half of it, you still have quite a lot of reductions for yourself, which you would not have done. Yes, you're giving away some of it, but you would not have been able to do it within the next 10 years by yourself. So there's still a clear benefit for countries doing this. And yeah, whether it's a cheap mitigation, I mean, that's part of the concept. The buying country will only do it if it's cheaper than what they can achieve by themselves. So that's clear. Why would they do it otherwise? Unless it's more like a 6.8, we don't want your emissions, but we're still supporting. So that's part of the concept. But then, of course, the pricing is, again, also in the hand of the host countries to some extent. There's a competition between host countries. But yeah, you should not give away your emission reductions too easily and cheaply without getting own benefits from it. That's obvious, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. What are you, because Bakum is actually coming next month. Mm-hmm. What is your wish list and what are your thoughts? What's going to happen next month during the COP?
Yeah. Well, specifically on Article 6, we didn't have an outcome for 6.2 and 6.4 in Dubai last year, so there were still some remaining issues that countries could not agree on, and which have to be resolved this year in Baku. There are issues around the registry, is not really easy, very different views on how to use the international registries, whether countries have to establish their own registries. So there are different views, and that's not easy, but it's a highly technical issue. Then other issues are also about the authorization, on when to authorize and if and how, and who is responsible. So, but in general, I think the after Dubai, it was a little difficult situation because also voluntary carbon markets and others are waiting for a clear signal from the parties from Article 6, and it didn't come. It's like, okay, we need another year to decide. So it's really crucial also that this year we have an outcome that provides guidance to also other standards and to countries on how to cooperate. This Article 6.2 is going on. There's basically more details in the guidance needed, but for Article 6.4 there's also guidance on removals and methodologies, and that just has to happen this year because last year it was supposed to happen already. I also believe that countries will know the urgency of a decision this time, and that we will have an outcome that will allow to move forward next year, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have now exhausted the entire 1 hour that was allotted to us, and there's quite a lot of questions coming in Slido. Jens would actually be around, so don't let him rest. So put in all your questions to Jens.
I mean, I'll be around for a little bit, so if you want to ask questions directly, that's fine. But otherwise, I would also just send us the questions. We're happy to send it back to you. I don't know who asked the questions, but maybe you can publish them as an outcome from the event. Happy to do that.
That will be fantastic. A note for the organizers. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for being sending in those questions and being interactive. And Jens, thank you very much for sharing your expert opinions on this Article 6 is something that we have not fully cracked, and hopefully we will have more clarity with the COP coming next month, and hopefully Malaysia with the new climate change bill, the designated authority being established, and hopefully the exchange and our CPI study being completed end of somewhere around next year. So we are hopeful in Malaysia we can accelerate this climate agenda. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And gents, thank you very much from all of us.
Right, once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to Mr. Jens Raczynski, the regional expert on Article 6. And of course, also thank you very much to Mr. Supun Nigamuni, as moderator, Managing Director of Control Unit Malaysia. Right, ladies and gentlemen, on a lighter note, all right, because I think since this morning we have quite an interesting topic discussion and what have you not, all right. So on a lighter note, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be breaking for lunch. Take advantage of this session for networking, establish, rapport, what have you not. And of course, be back right here at the ballroom by 1:30. So meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, like I said earlier on a lighter note, do enjoy the networking lunch session and be back right here at the ballroom 301 by 1:30 for yet another breakout session. All this and more in conjunction with the Green Legacy Johor Summit 2024.